Riverton was a town in northern Alabama where the pine trees reached to the sky and the country roads burned with dusty fatigue. It was a place that lived with the shadows of the past. Injustice permeated the streets like an ordinary reality. People knelt and prayed in church every morning, but on those same streets they seemed to have forgotten that equality was just a word. James Carter was one of Riverton's marginalized residents. He lived in an old shack that had been his father's, which stood alone at the end of a wide field road. As the last remaining member of his family, James remembered the stories told by his mother, who once spoke of freedom. But freedom was only a dream for the black residents of Riverton. In the center of town was the courthouse, always kept clean, but radiating a cold sense of hostility even on hot days. It became a symbol of fear instead of justice. James always looked at it, imagining the arguments echoing inside. But no one had ever seen a black man walk out of the courthouse doors with justice. Clara Whitley was known as the delicate flower of the town. Her blonde hair reflected the sunlight, and her porcelain skin attracted the attention of all the men in town. To James, Clara's presence was a bittersweet reminder of how differently lives were valued in Riverton. Clara's father was one of the town's respected farmers, and Sheriff Langston obeyed his every command. James' life had always avoided intersecting with Clara's. The town severely penalized any interracial interaction. Occasionally, however, James would witness Clara patting a child's hand as they shopped in the market. There was a warmth in Clara's gaze, but it wasn't strong enough to change the rules of Riverton. Sheriff Langston was the town's representative of justice, but in fact its greatest fear. With his broad shoulders and cold gaze, he walked the streets like a hurricane. The sheriff was known for his hatred of black people and used this hatred as a threat at every opportunity. James tried to suppress the fear that rose in him at the mere mention of the sheriff's name. Riverton's silence was like the restlessness before a storm. It was as if the streets of the town knew of the impending tragedy, but did not speak of it. James had built walls around himself to survive, but he sensed that one day those walls would crumble. On a day when the scorching heat of summer left the town breathless, news spread that shook Riverton to its core. Clara Whitley had been attacked in the woods near their farm, and James Carter was said to be the perpetrator. The news hit the streets of the town like a bolt of lightning, striking both anger and fear. Clara's silent tears and her family's anger combined with the town's desire to find the culprit. The rumor that James had been in the woods that day was enough for the townspeople, even if there was no truth to it. "James Carter is involved," Sheriff Langston shouted, without looking for any evidence. That night, James was dragged from his home and locked in the town's dark cellar before he had a chance to contest the charges. The trial was presented as a show of justice. The entire town filled the courtroom. James was represented by a tired lawyer who was visibly disinterested in the case. The jury had already decided before the trial began guilty. Even when Clara admitted she couldn't recall the details of the incident clearly, her hesitation was dismissed by the court as irrelevant. The gleam of triumph in Sheriff Langston's eyes made the fear in James' eyes all the more apparent. James's inner struggle grew with each passing day. He knew it was impossible to clear his life, his family, and his name. Still, he would not stop shouting that he was innocent. His mother's words, "Do the right thing, no matter what the cost," echoed in his mind. Although these words gave him the strength to resist, Riverton's prejudices were as thick as walls. James felt he could not break through them alone. Everyone in town seemed united in support of Clara's family. But some were uncomfortable with the direction this case was taking. A young girl, Clara's childhood friend, had seen James on the other side of town that day. Fear of retaliation kept her silent during the trial, but weeks later, guilt pushed her to come forward with the truth. The truth was lost in the shadow of fear. When the trial ended, James' fate was sealed. When the death sentence echoed through the streets of the town, it was clear that justice had once again been silenced. While Clara kept silent under the pressure of her family, James's helplessness and the way he satisfied the town's anger was the darkest side of this story. James Carter spent his last night in Riverton's cold jail. The quiet streets of the town seemed crushed under the weight of his impending execution. Behind the iron bars of the jail, James clasped his hands together and murmured a prayer. He tried to hope, as his mother had taught him, justice will come one day. Standing on the scaffold, James cast his gaze over the silent crowd. "I am innocent," he declared, his voice trembling yet defiant. The weight of his words seemed to hang in the air, though most averted their eyes, unable to face the truth. James prayed one last time, thinking of his family and all his loved ones. His voice felt as if it had spread to every corner of Riverton. But when the rope was around his neck, the town fell silent. A few weeks after the incident, the peace of the town was again disturbed by the appearance of a young girl. Clara's childhood friend gave a testimony that proved James was elsewhere at the time of the attack. In addition, a hat found in the woods pointed to a young man belonging to one of the town's wealthy families as the culprit. But the revelation of the truth could not bring James back. Clara Whitley never regained her former peace in Riverton. When she learned of James's innocence, guilt weighed on her like a burden. In her memories, the day James shouted his innocence at her was always fresh. Even the quiet residents of the town began to feel remorse within themselves. But the voice of justice was long overdue, and James' life could not be restored. James' family decided to fight to clear his name. Haunted by the injustice, James's family sought to restore his name, despite knowing it wouldn't bring him back. Years later, when new evidence forced the town to acknowledge his innocence, Riverton faced a reckoning with its own guilt. The streets of the town were silent. People realized how heavy the price was, even when they saw that justice would one day be served. Clara spent the rest of her life working in a church. She tried to live a life of charity, remembering James' name and trying to repay her debt to him. But on the stone streets of Riverton, it remained a fact that neither she nor the town could forgive James Carter's innocence. With his life, James had once again exposed the injustice of society. This was the story of Riverton, a place where justice comes too late but prejudice never goes away.